All right, so we're finally getting into some of the details on evolution. Previously, we've talked about some of the concepts, the general examples of how evolution happens, but now we're going to talk about detail. So we're going to get into population genetics. I did place, if I can get the slide to move, I did place a vocab slide in there. This will give you a list of the vocab terms. You should, I'll go over these as we go and use them in the next, several slides. But what you want to do is you want to use this as your starting point for adding things from this section into your Quizlet or writing note cards or whatever you do. All right, so first, evolution occurs in populations, not individuals. So not X-Men, sorry, not this one pigeon here. That pigeon is not evolving. The population, though, can evolve. So populations, not individuals. All right, so just a couple definitions. The gene pool is the entire collection of genes in a population. So when we talk about the gene pool, we're talking about all individuals, what their genes are in one big collection. Allele frequency is the number of times an allele appears in the gene pool. So our gene pool, if we have 10 individuals, and those individuals, like humans, are going to have 2 copies of each different gene, then they might have a big H allele and a little h allele. So maybe we have, I'm trying to write these in sort of pairs. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Okay, so this is 5 individuals worth of alleles. So this is our gene pool with 5 individuals, okay? So in this gene pool, we have 4 copies of big H and 6 copies of little h. So that's the allele frequency, the number of times an allele would appear in the gene pool. Now, we're not worried about what individuals have phenotypically. What we're worried about is just the allele frequency. Genetic equilibrium is a gene pool which is not changing in allele frequencies. So your gene pool is going to be relatively stable. You're going to have about the same number of big H's as little h's, for example. A population that is at genetic equilibrium is one that is not evolving. All right, now we can get changes in the gene pool. So mutation can introduce new alleles into a gene pool. So here we have our 2 parents. They both have the green allele. And then there's a mutated gene, which gives us this brown allele. So we get this new allele added into the gene pool. So this gene for color of the carapace, it looks like, because there's the brown part versus the green part. We now have this new brown allele. We don't just have the green allele for that coloration gene. Random change in allele frequency over time can also happen. So this is genetic drift. We talked about that before. But here's an example actually looking at percents. So if our first generation, we have these 3 mating pairs. So our first generation, 3 mating pairs. And if we count up the number of green alleles, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have 9 green alleles. And then we have 1, 2, 3 brown alleles. So 3 brown and 9 green. So it's 75% green, 25% brown. Now in our second generation, the children we're going to count up their alleles. So here we have 8 green, just going to be easier than counting them one at a time. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 green, which leaves us with 3 brown. And then here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 green and 4 brown. So total, we would have 17 green and 7 brown. And working out that math, our population has shifted a little bit. We are now 71% green alleles and 29% brown alleles. So we are getting more brown alleles over time. Now, if this was something that had a strong selective pressure, what we might see is that the green ones maybe would be eaten before they had any babies. Then we would see a bigger change in this allele percentage. If that happened, so if all of these were eaten, we only had one green left, so this middle mating pair was eaten before they had babies, we would have 9 green, and we would still have 7 brown. So the percentages there would be 56% green and then 44% brown. So you can see that if you have more selective pressure, if you have that natural selection happening, where birds are, for instance, eating the green beetles, you can get these allele frequencies changing dramatically over time. But it can just change randomly as well. Now, random change typically, unless there's some big event, is going to be at a smaller level. So going from 75 to 71%, for example. All right, so here's a gene flow example. This is where we have an increase of possible alleles between populations because we're having things like move between populations. This can change the frequency in both. So here we have these individuals are immigrating into this population over here. So, sorry. All right, the population right here has mostly green alleles. We've only got 2 brown alleles out of our total 6 beetles. So we have, 12 alleles total and only 2 are brown. But here, these individuals that are moving in, they're carrying with the 3 individuals 4 brown alleles and only 2 green. So they're adding more of those brown alleles into the gene pool. Now here's the example with natural selection. And I already kind of talked about this on the previous slide, so you could see the differences in percent changes. So for larger populations, natural selection is the significant factor which causes change in allele frequency. So for larger populations, this is going to be super important. The predator eats the more easily seen beetles that lack the brown gene. This results in an increase in brown gene frequency. So for every green beetle that they eat that has 2 of the green alleles, we are removing those alleles from the gene pool, increasing the frequency, the percent of brown alleles. All right. We have a couple other ways that this can happen at the population level. So speciation, or a couple other things that can happen at the population level. So speciation, this is the production of 2 or more species. And this can happen when we're talking about organisms that previously were interbreeding, but something happened to change that. So in this instance, we're going to talk about geographic isolation, which is some physical barrier or geography separating the populations. So you start with one population. These are one population of one species. You get a river that flows between the 2 and it separates them, or a mountain or something. There's a drought and there's this giant desert, and you separate this large population of beetles into 2 populations, one on each side of whatever that isolation instance is. After that physical barrier comes in, we have these 2 groups responding separately to environmental changes. Because you don't get any gene flow, you don't get any moving back and forth between these 2, they're going to act as 2 separate populations. So here we had one population, here we have population 1 and population 2, okay? Now, over time, population 1, you can see here, got more green beetles. Maybe the environment in population 1 has like more green bushes that the beetles can live on, whereas population 2 lives in an area with just trees, and so they're seen very easily on the bark of the green beetles would be seen very easily on the bark of the tree and would be eaten if that allele popped up. So over time, we get these 2 very different looking populations, and eventually, if they can no longer breed with each other, then we would have 2 separate species. Now that breeding with each other, that is that's one of the ways we can define species. In this class, we're not going to worry about all the different species definitions, but there are lots of different ways we can decide who is and who isn't part of a species. This is one of the best ones because it gives us a way to actually look at how those genes are going to be able to move. So if the green beetle can't intermate with the brown beetle, then they definitely are different species because they can't share genes. and that like can intermate with them. It could just be that the green beetles all go through their mating during April and the brown ones do it during February. That's enough of an isolation after this geographic isolation to make them separate species. Now, there are other ways that they could change based on this geographic isolation into different species. That isolation could cause them to evolve very differently in the two different habitats. It just depends on what's going on. So we'll see some examples as we go through. All right, now we can also have reproductive isolation, which happens even without a geographic barrier. So I talked about the geographic barrier happening first and that leading to them not being able to mate. So geographic isolation led to reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is groups that can no longer sexually reproduce. And this can happen because of a couple things: behavior, mating patterns, physical differences. This little cartoon posits that we have specific kinds of fruit flies that only like one kind of fruit for when they're looking for a mate. So over time, you only get the lighter colored fruit flies on the mangoes with green eyes. So all of the mango fruit flies would be green-eyed yellow. And then all of the banana fruit flies would be brown and red-eyed. That would just be their mating pattern. When they look for a mate, they go to this type of fruit, and therefore they are only going to mate within those individuals. Now, over time, we might see that these are two species of fruit fly. So over many, many generations, you might have a situation where this fruit fly could not mate with this fruit fly. All right, so I'm going to talk about a couple ways we talk about evolution now. So gradualism, this is the idea that species evolve at a slow, constant rate. So here we have over time and morphological change from our common ancestor. So we have our common ancestor, and we have like slight differences here, and then they can get broader, more differences between the two species as time goes by. But this is happening at a very slow, constant rate. Now, there's another theory called punctuated equilibrium that suggests that there are rapid, significant changes over a short time. Now, punctuated equilibrium often hypothesizes that there would have had to be a dramatic environmental change or something that would cause natural selection to be to have lots of pressure. So the species would have lots of selection pressure put on it over these shorter time periods that are going to be the root cause of this evolutionary change. All right, a couple different types of evolution. So we have divergent evolution, where new species develop from a single common ancestor and they get very, very different. They diverge from each other. So we have our common ancestor is a mid-sized with yellow butterfly. And over time we get, this one has orange and is getting slightly bigger. This one's getting smaller. Possibly the smaller and the larger could then fill two separate niches in the habitat that the medium butterfly would have been unable to fill. And so over time, we end up with the large species and a smaller butterfly species. So two new species from one common ancestor. Convergent evolution is one of these things that we can use to talk about evidence for evolution. In convergent evolution, you have similar adaptations due to similar environments or needs. So similar selection pressures result in similar structures. So fish are aquatic vertebrates. They are not mammals. Dolphins are aquatic mammals. Both have similar adaptations to life in the sea, but they are not closely related. Dolphins are going to be more closely related to land mammals than they are to fish. But the fins and the tails, the sleek bodies, these are called analogous structures because those structures are adaptations because they live in the same environment. So this is one example of the pressure of the environment is actually causing this natural selection and therefore evolution over time. We also have coevolution. So I want to talk about this because, number one, it's cool. But number two, coevolution is a great example of another way that this natural selection can happen. Organisms are ecologically intimate. And what that means is that organisms interact with each other a lot. Examples are predators and prey, host and parasite. They can influence each other's evolution when they are in such close proximity to each other and living in these interconnected ways. So here's an example, a fruit-eating bird co-evolving with the plants whose fruit they eat. Here's an example of a nectar-eating bird whose beak is very curved and it matches that flower almost perfectly because these flower nectar-drinking birds have co-evolved with the shape of the flower. So this is just a really cool thing. All right, practice. Make a Quizlet or study a Quizlet, something that includes these terms at minimum. I would go back to that first vocab slide and do that. You do not have to turn this in. This is just your homework. So make sure you do it because we will be having a test.